welcome back for the second part of our photography techniques video. You can tell that things have changed a little bit since then. I've finally been able to have a haircut. That other guy who was in that other video, he was scary, so we got rid of him. So we're looking a little more fresh these days. This particular video, I'm shooting it in front of my house, which seems like a really bad idea, but it's really windy and it's kind of sheltered here. It's also a bad idea because traffic will sometimes drive by and people will walk down the street and see me talking to myself and think I'm a weirdo. But most of my neighbors know that I'm a weirdo already. Anyway, hopefully you paid attention to the last couple of videos and did all those assignments. Make sure you go into Teams and turn in your assignments there so that you can get the marks for those. The last time we were talking about 3 composition techniques, which we'll keep in mind this time as well. We talked about framing your subject, leading and disappearing lines, and contrast, and all those things. When you're going to take photos, just keep those things in mind and try to look for them. And sometimes you can actually combine more than one technique with another. So you'll see some of the examples that I'm showing you today. You might be able to recognize sometimes I use the rule of thirds, sometimes I don't. Sometimes there's leading lines going up to these things, and sometimes there's not. So really, I'm kind of giving you these weird assignments where you have to go and look for specific things. But eventually, when you're taking your own photos just for fun, just keep your eyes open for examples of those different techniques and try them out. The other thing I mentioned last time was take a lot of photos. You're never going to get perfect photos every time. So for this assignment, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of photos. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are terrible. But hopefully they work. To kind of give you an idea. I'll show you some of my photos, and I'll download some off the internet just kind of to show you the techniques a little bit better as well, because some of them are a little bit more challenging. So the first one I want to talk about is probably the easiest one of the 3, and that's called perspective or viewpoint. Basically, the way we look at things is our own perspective or our own viewpoint. We see things from a certain way, and trying to understand perhaps how other people think or how other people view the world makes us kind of better people, makes us more understanding and compassionate people. When we're looking at photos, what I talk about perspective or viewpoint, so there's 2 different ways of thinking about that. Number one is if you take a photo from the perspective or viewpoint of a certain person or thing, that can be an interesting photo. So my helper today, I left Fezzik, I gave him the day off. He was kind of white and kind of bright for everything that I was doing. So I wanted to try bringing somebody else to work today. And so we're going to be joined by Paul Stanley from KISS. So let's rock and roll all night and party every day. And he's going to help us out today. So instead of taking a photo of Paul Stanley, perhaps for some of the photos we might want to look at it from Paul's perspective. So we kind of look over his shoulder or kind of look at what he's seeing. That might make a kind of interesting photo. So you'll see some photos kind of like that. But the other way to understand perspective or viewpoint is just to look at things in a new way, a different way. So if we see something that we see all the time, like a basketball hoop, we always see pictures of a basketball hoop or a flagpole, the Canadian flag. Well, what if we kind of look at that from a different angle, try to see things from a different way? So one of my students before brought me a photo kind of looking up at the basketball hoop instead of straight at it. And that made a really interesting photo. So his photo was probably better, but my example is here. Same thing with the flag. Instead of looking at it straight on, why don't we try looking up at that flag and seeing how that looks? Or if we're talking about Paul here, maybe we elevate Paul up and we kind of look at him from an angle and we kind of shoot from down below him, or even from up above, and see how that looks. So we're going to take him and kind of take a photo of him in different ways. Instead of looking straight at him on eye level, we're going to try looking down on him a little bit, maybe up at him a little bit, and that gives us a new or fresh perspective or viewpoint. And as you walk around to take your photos, and I really would recommend, if you're allowed and if you're able and if you're safe, walk around your neighborhood, and just take a look at some things and try to look at them from a different point. Instead of looking at that tree, looking straight at it, why don't you go under the tree and shoot up through the tree and see how that looks? Maybe it looks good, maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's some flowers in your yard. Instead of looking straight at the flowers, maybe you look straight down at them, something like that. Maybe that gives you an interesting viewpoint. And that's kind of the exercise here, is to try to look at things in a new or interesting way to give you a new perspective or a new viewpoint. So have some fun with that and take a bunch of different pictures. Try out different things. Try out, if you have a little toy, you can try that out. If a lot of these things work really well if you have a human subject. Unfortunately, my family won't participate in my photography assignments, so I don't really have a person to take a photo of. And our cat just sleeps all the time, so that's not really a fun photo either. So that's why I'm using Paul here. I also brought some other little things to take photos with. So pick your subject depending on what you're trying to do. The second thing I want you to try to look for when you're taking your photos is a nice pattern. So I purposely kind of sat in front of this wall of my house here because it kind of has this pattern on it. And that pattern can help to accentuate your subject. Now sometimes the pattern is interesting enough that that is the subject. So if you can find something that looks really cool, a really lovely pattern, then you probably don't need a subject. But sometimes it just has a pattern. And then when your brain sees a pattern, it figures it out real quick and it expects that pattern to continue. But when something pops up to kind of break that pattern, it can often be interesting. So I often look at the pattern on my bathroom floor. And it's kind of interesting, it's kind of neat, but it's got all these shapes on it. And they're mostly rectangular and diamond shapes and things like that. So I thought, what would happen if I put a nice circular subject right on that pattern? So what happens is your brain sees the pattern, recognizes it, but then all of a sudden something breaks up that pattern. It doesn't fit into the pattern, so we're drawn to that. So this is not the most interesting subject in the world. I just picked it because it's round and it's colorful, and it kind of stood out from that pattern on my bathroom floor. So that's why I picked this particular subject for that photo. Plus I get to show off my vintage St. Louis Blues puck from when I was a kid. I found all these hockey pucks from hockey teams from when I was a kid, but I can't find my Jets one. I don't know what happened to it. I'll look for it. Anyway, so look for patterns, and either if it's a really interesting pattern, take a picture of that, or like I say, use that pattern to accentuate your subject. So in behind me here, I have that brick wall. Kind of makes me stand out a little bit more. Certainly doesn't make me any better looking or any more interesting, that's for sure. But at least it helps me to stand out a little bit. So tip number 2, look for patterns. The third thing that I want you to look for is something you probably know from math class, and that's called symmetry. And symmetry is basically when you can take your picture and you can fold it in half, and both sides are basically the same, then that's symmetry. And in math, we look for patterns, or we look for shapes that are symmetrical. They have the exact same thing on each side. Now, when we're doing this with photography, it does not have to be perfectly symmetrical. So when I look down my back lane, for example, I see that both sides, if you look at them in detail, they're not exactly the same. But because they both have the fences down the side and the garages and the trees and everything, it looks symmetrical. So it's not perfectly the same, but it has kind of that balance to it. It has a very similar look on the left and the right side of the picture. You can also do this vertically as well. This works really, really well if you have some clear water and a nice reflection in it. So if you see some photos sometimes where what's on the land is reflecting really well into the water, that can look symmetrical as well. And so we can look for different things that work horizontally and vertically with that symmetry. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of balanced to look kind of interesting. And I know this picture of me basically could be symmetrical as well if we folded this in half. My left side is basically the same as my right, and I'm not using the rule of thirds, so I'm right in the middle here. And that would be symmetrical as well. Not the most interesting example, but it is an example. I prefer something where there actually is something interesting on each side instead of just one thing in the middle. So technically I'm symmetrical here, but I would prefer something where there's something on each side. So basically we have 3 things to look at today. And again, when you're looking at these photos, you might notice examples of the other techniques that we looked at as well. So if you see other things in your photos and you want to include that in your file name, or you want to tell me which photos actually show more than one technique. That would be cool too. So basically I want three things here. I want you to show me some patterns, and in particular, perhaps how those patterns make a subject stand out. I want you to look at things from a different viewpoint, a different perspective. And lastly, symmetry. But again, if you if you use the rule of thirds here, or you find examples of framing your subject or leading lines, please make sure you point that out as well. So that's basically it for these composition tips. Hopefully you're having fun with these. Just go out and take a whole bunch of photos and see if you can use some of these tips to make your photos better. And like I said, take a whole lot of photos. You only have to drop off examples of each. You don't really have to explain, but do go into Teams and press turn in so that I know your work is done and so that I can give you a mark there. Hope you're all staying safe, keeping clean and healthy, and looking out for one another. And hopefully we'll see you again real soon. You take good care of yourself now.